Okay, now in order to come to those truth claims, you're employing your reasoning, correct?
To an extent, but I'm also employing the reasonings of thousands of other men.
But in order to interpret what those thousands of other people say, you're employing your reasoning.
Yes.
Okay, so truth, you know through your reasoning, right?
That's his truth. Along with.
All right, but the thing is, you have to reason about what other people say. My question to you, sir, is how do you know your reasoning's valid?
I don't.
That's right. So if you don't know your reasoning's valid, would it not follow that you can't know anything to be true?
Yes.
Okay. So you know that nobody can know anything. You know that for certain.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a certain knowledge claim. Now let me ask you this question. In order to come to that certain knowledge claim, are you employing your reasoning?
Yes.
Okay, now let me ask you this question. How do you know your reasoning about anything is valid?
Because it's based off of other things.
So
when you start from a base thing that you can't contest with, there's one thing to speculate, but I can look down, and I know I'm looking down because I perform the action of looking down.
So what you're doing is you're telling me that you know your reasoning is valid by using your reasoning.
I'm using evidence to come up with a way of reasoning.
Right, but the thing is, I'm asking you how you know your reasoning is valid. And you're using your reasoning.
Because it's not my...
So in order to know things, you're employing your sense and your reasoning, right? You said, I know there's a tree there. I know the ground is solid. I know these things to be self-evident true. You're employing your sense and your reasoning, correct?
Yes.
How do you know your sense and reasoning are valid?
The same way you...
Hang on.
Because they are valid.
Okay, would you agree that there's people on this earth who have invalid senses and reasoning?
Yes.
How would they know if they're invalid?
Well, after a while, they find out, they take the colorblind test, and they're like, oh,
so they would need valid
black and
reasoning
white.
to find out that their reasoning is invalid.
Sorry, what?
They would need valid reasoning to find out that their reasoning is invalid. If there's people who have invalid reasoning, how do you know you're not one of those people?
Because...
Now, if he says that he can be certain about things, then I would ask him how he can be certain about things. He would have to employ his senses and reasoning, and I'd ask him how he knows they are valid. And if he could be wrong about everything he claims to know, he can't know that they are valid. And that's the problem.
In logic, we call this circular reasoning. You assume the thing you're trying to prove. Surely you can't do that. Surely, Eli, you're telling us this is an inappropriate way of interacting with the unbeliever. Well, if we were talking about something that is not fundamental, something that is not ultimate in our thinking, then you're correct. It is a logical fallacy to engage in circular reasoning. However, it is not a fallacy when you are talking about ultimate commitments, our ultimate authority in our thinking and our reasoning. Someone says, you can't assume something before you demonstrate it. Well, let me tell you, unbeliever, do you believe that we should use our reasoning when we're interacting about these issues? Well, of course. Reason and science, right? Can you prove to me the validity of your reasoning without using your reasoning? Think about that. He'll have to assume the validity of his reasoning to demonstrate to me that his reasoning is valid. He has to assume the very thing I'm asking him to prove.
Circular reasoning is generally understood to be fallacious. The reason for this is that circular arguments assume what they purport to prove. At least one premise in a circular argument depends upon the truth of the conclusion, making the argument lose any justifying force. For in order to accept the relevant premise, one would have to already believe the conclusion. But if one already believes the conclusion, then one has no need for the argument. And if one does not already believe the conclusion, then the argument will not yield any grounds for belief. Despite the seeming obviousness of what I have just said, it nevertheless remains startlingly popular to claim that circular reasoning is, in some cases, acceptable and, even worse, ultimately unavoidable. This claim is common among those Christian apologists known as presuppositionalists. For example, John Frame claims, there is no alternative to circularity. No system can avoid circularity because all systems, as we have seen, non-Christian as well as Christian, are based on presuppositions that control their epistemologies, argumentation, and use of evidence. The critic of circular reasoning will inevitably be just as guilty of circular reasoning. It is not my purpose here to critique circular reasoning in general or to offer a non-circular alternative, although I have done this elsewhere. See my series on epistemology for a more developed theory of knowledge which avoids circular reasoning. My purpose in this video is to critique one popular argument commonly employed by presuppositionalists, which purports to show that circular reasoning is unavoidable. The argument is typically phrased something like this: you must use reason in order to prove reason, or sometimes it is implied in a question along the lines of, how do you know that your reasoning is valid? The thrust of the argument seems to be that since one cannot prove reason apart from the use of reason, circularity is simply inescapable. Although I don't encounter this argument much in scholarly literature, at least not in this form, it is rather popular among internet presuppositionalists. And while I generally prefer to discuss scholarly issues on this channel, the pervasiveness of this argument, coupled with the fact that I am not aware of any direct interaction with it, moves me to make this video in reply. In this video, I intend to briefly explain my motivation for addressing this argument. After that, I will try to disambiguate the argument and clarify both what it means and how one might respond. After disambiguating the argument, I shall argue that it either assumes a theory of epistemic justification which can be rejected, or else it fails to recognize an important distinction between two different types of usage. Under either interpretation, I shall argue that circular reasoning can be avoided. Before engaging the argument directly, it will be helpful to provide some motivation for examining it at all. After all, why should the argument concern us? Is it really a problem if all justification is circular in the end? Or perhaps we should not even try to justify the reliability of reasoning. Perhaps it is simply a fundamental assumption of all philosophical inquiry, which needs no justification. It would be an understatement to say that many philosophers are content to say that belief in the reliability of reason can only be justified in a circular way. Still others take the essential reliability of reason to be a fundamental axiom which is incapable of justification and which needs none. But I have never found such answers to be satisfactory. I have never been content to suppose that I should require justification for my beliefs down to the bottom level, but then give the foundational beliefs a free pass. Such a move seems completely arbitrary and even inconsistent. If our most foundational beliefs are unjustified, then I take this to entail that all beliefs which depend on them for their justification are likewise unjustified. I suspect that many viewers feel the same way, but this conviction forces those of us who hold it to face the original argument. For if there is no non-circular means of justifying foundational beliefs, then we may well have to face the conclusion that none of our beliefs are justified. For those wishing to avoid such a gloomy conclusion, there is strong motivation for addressing the original argument. Having provided some motivation, let's turn to assess the merits of the argument. Roughly, we are concerned with the claim that one must use reason to justify reasoning. Stated thusly, the claim is quite incoherent. Reasoning is a deliberative cognitive process. It is not a proposition. It is not the sort of thing which can be true or false. As such, reasoning itself needs no justification, since it is an action rather than a belief. Imagine how absurd it would be to demand justification for walking, or for driving, or for swimming. Such activities need no justification precisely because they are activities rather than propositions. Once we have understood that only propositions require justification due to their potential to be false, it becomes evident that the act of reasoning does not need justification because it is non-propositional. Sometimes the problem is phrased as a question along the lines of, how do you know that your reasoning is valid? But stated in this way, the argument is guilty of a category error. Validity is not a property of reasoning, but rather a property of arguments. To be sure, we sometimes speak of valid and invalid reasoning, but this sort of language refers not to the cognitive processes themselves, but rather to the validity of the logical inferences that the reasoning is following. To say that one's reasoning is literally valid makes as little sense as saying that one's driving is valid or that one's swimming is valid. Validity simply doesn't apply to activities, it applies to arguments. But perhaps it will be objected that I have missed the point. After all, I am taking advantage of very poorly worded versions of the argument. As I observed earlier, This argument is not as prominent among scholars as it is among presuppositionalists on the internet. But I do think that addressing these muddled versions of the argument is an important task because it helps us to clarify what is and what is not at issue. Moreover, it forces those who would use these problematic formulations of the argument to be more precise. Finally, pointing out the incoherence of these simplistic formulations of the argument can also serve to rob them of their rhetorical force. So let me attempt to reconstruct a more sensible version of the argument. It seems to me that when someone says that we must use reason to justify reasoning, they mean that one must use their ability to reason in order to defend the proposition that reasoning is reliable. One must, in effect, assume that their ability to reason is a reliable guide to truth. Certainly, this is a much more robust argument, but to answer it, we must seek still greater clarification. Before turning to answer the more robust version of the argument, we must ask what is meant by the phrase, reason is reliable. Taken quite literally, it would mean that the cognitive process of reasoning itself somehow yields justification for beliefs by virtue of being reliable. Taken in this way, the argument is saying that one must assume that reasoning yields justification for beliefs by virtue of being reliable in order to reach the conclusion that reasoning yields justification for beliefs by virtue of being reliable. Thus construed, the argument appears to be assuming that the reliability of reason is a necessary condition for justification. This appears to essentially be a reliabilist epistemology. Reliabilism is a theory of epistemic justification, according to which beliefs are justified if they have been produced by a reliable process. If this is what the proponent of the argument is claiming, then we may happily agree with him. It is not at all controversial that reliabilism and externalist theories of justification more generally are committed to approving of epistemic circularity. This is a well-known fact which is typically admitted by reliabilists and critics of reliabilism alike. Notice, however, that if this is what the argument is trying to establish, then it assumes reliabilism and reaches the uncontroversial conclusion that reliabilism leads to circularity. However, not all philosophers are reliabilists. Reliabilism's main contender is known as evidentialism. According to evidentialism, the justification that any subject has for a belief is always relative to the evidence which that subject possesses for that belief. As Earl, Conee, and Richard Feldman explain, evidentialism is the view that the epistemic justification of a belief is determined by the quality of the believer's evidence for the belief. It serves to indicate the kind of notion of justification that we take to be characteristically epistemic, a notion that makes justification turn entirely on evidence. Evidentialism seeks justification in evidence, not in reliable processes. Hence, the argument considered earlier will simply not work against evidentialism because it assumes a theory of justification which the evidentialist rejects. As such, one need only reject reliabilism in order for the argument to fail to establish that circularity is unavoidable. Now, the critic of evidentialism and the defender of this argument might want to maintain that we cannot really escape reliability requirements by asking if evidence is reliable, but this is just to misunderstand the nature of evidence and reliability. Reliability refers to belief sources which produce true beliefs more often than not. Evidence, by contrast, refers to sources of justification, not sources of belief. A belief which comes from a fundamentally unreliable source may nevertheless be justified when it is accompanied by sufficient evidence. As Barrett-Brogard points out, evidentialism has a simple reply to this argument. The evidentialist will maintain that this argument rests on externalist considerations, the idea that evidence must be reliable. But this is exactly what the evidentialist denies. Nevertheless, evidentialists still do use reason to arrive at justified beliefs. Evidentialists still have to reason from evidence to conclusions. They still use reason. Does this indicate that there is still some circularity on the part of the evidentialist? In order to answer this, we will need to be clear on what is meant by using reason. There are two quite distinct ways in which we might use things to justify our beliefs. We use things in a justificatory sense, and we also use things in a functional sense. Something is used in a justificatory sense when it is offered as a rational justification for a belief. It is being used to support the truth of the belief. Something is used in a functional sense when it is employed as a tool in the process of ascertaining or offering rational justification. Crucially, nothing about a functional usage contributes to the rational justification for a belief. It is simply a means of helping a subject see that justification for what it is. The upshot is that functional usage doesn't even have the potential to be circular because circularity can only apply to justification. We can see this distinction more clearly through an illustration. Imagine that I am debating a friend over the existence of pencils. I am trying to convince him that pencils actually exist. Moreover, suppose that this debate is mediated by means of letters. In my attempt to convince my friend that pencils are real, I offer him numerous syllogistic arguments in support of the existence of pencils. Now let's say that I use a pencil to write out these arguments for him. In this case, it would be quite correct to say that I used a pencil to justify my belief in the existence of pencils, but the usage was entirely functional. At no point did I use the proposition that pencils exist as a premise in an argument which concluded that pencils exist. The premises in my argument are what I am using to justify my belief in pencils. Therefore, the justification of my belief in pencils is not circular, even though I used a pencil to justify that belief. This is because the usage of the pencil was functional rather than justificatory. This illustration is fairly analogous to what I have in mind when I say that evidentialists use reason to justify their beliefs. While it is true that we must think critically, we must reason, in order to justify our inferential beliefs, we are not using reason as the rational basis for any of our beliefs. The evidence provides the justification for our beliefs, and reason is just the process of evaluating it and recognizing the support relations which hold between our evidence and the propositions which we believe. At no point does the process of reasoning itself contribute to the justification of a belief. For any proposition which I hold to be true, if you were to ask me why I accept that proposition as true, I will never answer by saying that I reasoned my way there, and I think that my reasoning process was reliable. On the contrary, I will answer by appealing to various facts which support the truth of the proposition. In other words, I will appeal to evidence. Reasoning without evidence from which to reason gets us nowhere. Reason is not some mystical ability which leads us to truth in and of itself. Reason requires facts to work with. It is simply a necessary means for reaching justified beliefs. Critically, we are not attributing justification to the reasoning process itself. Our use of it is not justificatory. It is functional. As such, our use of reason, when seeking to justify our beliefs, is not circular. In this video, I have assessed the claim that epistemic circularity is unavoidable, since one must, in fact, use reason to justify their beliefs about the truth-finding nature of reasoning. I have determined that the argument is usually framed in an unclear and incoherent way. When it is made intelligible, it assumes epistemic reliabilism, and, therefore, it is forceless against evidentialism. Any attempt to press the argument against evidentialism will beg the question against evidentialism. Moreover, attempts to modify it to face evidentialism on the basis that evidentialists use reason fail to acknowledge the distinction between functional and justificatory usage. Since evidentialists only use reason in a functional sense, they are not guilty of epistemic circularity.